The sanctuary was quiet except for the faint hum of air conditioning. Rows of empty pews glowed in the light filtering through stained glass, and on the pulpit, where Reverend Thomas Whitaker once preached about humility and sacrifice, an envelope sat taped to the wood. It contained a note that would unravel one of the most scandalous stories in his small Georgia town, a story of faith traded for fortune. Whitaker had been the town's spiritual compass for nearly 2 decades. People trusted him the way they trusted sunrise, steady, dependable, always there when the darkness lifted. He was the kind of preacher who knew every family's struggle, who baptized their children, blessed their homes, and helped bury their dead. But behind the sermons about modesty and stewardship, something darker was quietly blooming, a hunger for wealth disguised as divine reward. It began with the new church project. The congregation was growing, and Whitaker spoke passionately about expanding God's house, a community center, a new fellowship hall, maybe even a daycare. He told them the Lord had given him a vision of a campus that would serve generations. Donations poured in, not just from church members, but from neighboring towns and even anonymous benefactors who watched his televised sermons online. He framed it as a revival, a movement of faith. The people believed him. The first red flag came when one of the deacons, a retired accountant named Harrell, asked to review the church's building fund ledger. Whitaker smiled, patted his shoulder, and said, "Brother Harrell, the Lord's work is in good hands." That became his refrain whenever someone asked for transparency. The Lord's work is in good hands. Eventually the question stopped. Faith replaced accountability. By the second year of the campaign, nearly $3 million had been raised. The lot behind the church had been cleared, but no construction crews ever came. Whitaker claimed delays, zoning issues, contractor disputes. Yet his sermons grew slicker, his suits sharper, and his driveway suddenly held a brand new Lexus. He told his congregation that blessings often came in unexpected forms. "When you walk with God," he said one Sunday, "He clothes you in abundance." Behind closed doors, Whitaker was funneling church donations through a web of shell accounts. The trail was subtle at first. Payments for consulting fees, small transfers to entities named after biblical verses. But then came luxury expenses hidden in plain sight. Personal vacations categorized as spiritual retreats, jewelry listed as pastoral gifts, even a private timeshare in Florida labeled mission property. The first real crack appeared when a young assistant pastor named Elijah noticed a payment to a company he couldn't verify. He brought it up gently, unsure if it was a mistake. Whitaker dismissed him with a smile, told him not to let worldly details cloud his spiritual path. But Elijah couldn't let it go. He began quietly printing statements from the church's shared drive, tucking them away in a folder marked Building Fund Archive. Months later, Elijah went to the state attorney general's office with what he'd found. The investigation that followed tore through the congregation like a storm. Federal auditors traced over $1.8 million in misappropriated funds, lavish vacations, high-end furniture, and private investments, all paid for by donations meant to build a house of worship. When federal agents arrived at the church one Thursday morning, Whitaker was in his office preparing Sunday's sermon, ironically titled, "The Virtue of Contentment." He didn't resist arrest. The congregation gathered outside, watching as their pastor, the man who'd christened their babies and buried their parents, was led away in handcuffs. Some wept. Others stood in stunned silence, holding Bibles like anchors in a sinking ship. The trial became a spectacle. Prosecutors painted Whitaker as a manipulative narcissist who cloaked greed in Scripture. His defense argued that he truly believed his personal success was a sign of divine favor, that he was simply enjoying the blessings his faith had earned. In the end, the jury took less than 4 hours to convict him on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. During sentencing, Whitaker finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost pastoral. "I didn't steal from God," he said. "I invested in his messenger." The courtroom fell silent. To some, it sounded like arrogance. To others, delusion. After his conviction, the church fractured. Some members left organized religion altogether. Others tried to rebuild, renaming the congregation under a new pastor who refused a salary for his first year. The lot where the new sanctuary was supposed to be built remains empty, a patch of grass and gravel, occasionally visited by those who still can't believe what happened. Years later, Whitaker filed a handwritten letter from prison to his former congregation. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was a sermon in disguise, written in his looping cursive. The Lord tests us through prosperity as much as he does through poverty. I failed the test, but so did those who believed a man could never sin if he stood behind a pulpit. The letter ended with one haunting line: if greed is a sin, then faith without discernment is its accomplice. Some say that was his first moment of clarity. Others believe he was still preaching, still shifting blame, still trying to control the story. But for the people of that small Georgia town, the lesson was carved deep, that sometimes the wolves don't hide among the sheep. They build the altar themselves. The congregation called it the Miracle on Maple Street. That's what they named the small-town revival that grew into a multi-million-dollar ministry under Pastor David Harrell. What began as a few dozen folding chairs in a rented community hall became a 3,000-member megachurch with cameras, lights, and broadcast sermons streaming across the country. But behind the applause and the gospel music, greed was tightening its grip around every hymn, every tithe envelope, every whispered amen. David Harrell was charming, not movie star handsome, but the kind of man who could look you straight in the eye and make you feel like God himself had stopped to listen. He had a way of preaching that made prosperity sound like destiny. The Lord, he would say, wants to see his children shine. And the people believed him, because who doesn't want their faith to be rewarded? His sermons grew louder, his suits brighter. The offerings doubled, then tripled. Harrell began promising seed blessings, donations that, according to him, would multiply in the hands of the faithful. If you gave $100, God would return tenfold. If you gave $1,000, he'd open the windows of heaven. People sold cars, mortgaged homes, even cashed in retirement accounts. The checks kept rolling in. It wasn't long before Harrell launched his own television ministry, Faith Unlimited. He broadcast from a studio built inside the church, decorated with gleaming gold trim and polished marble floors. The same congregation that once worshipped in a gymnasium now stood beneath chandeliers. The pastor began hosting luxury faith cruises, week-long retreats on private ships for partners in prosperity. The brochures showed Harrell standing on the deck, Bible in hand, promising divine abundance to those who could afford the ticket. But beneath the glamour, whispers began to spread. A maintenance worker claimed the church credit card had been used to buy expensive watches. A secretary found that donation receipts were being altered before being entered into the system. The assistant treasurer, a young woman named Maria, began to notice discrepancies, large withdrawals categorized as missions abroad, though no trips were being taken. When she brought it to Harrell's attention, he smiled gently and said, "You worry too much about earthly details. Have faith." Maria didn't push further, not yet, but she started copying records in secret, saving them to an external drive. She saw patterns forming, hundreds of thousands wired to personal accounts under fake charitable names, lavish hotel stays billed as conferences, and a mysterious payment labeled Divine Development Initiative, which traced back to Harrell's own offshore corporation. In 2017, an investigative journalist from a local newspaper received an anonymous tip, an envelope with photocopies of bank statements and a short note that read, "The pastor's treasure isn't in heaven." The journalist, intrigued, started digging. Within weeks, the story broke. Megachurch pastor accused of misusing millions in donations. Harrell stood at the pulpit that Sunday, defiant. Cameras recorded his fiery sermon as he thundered about satanic attacks on his ministry. "They want to destroy what God is building," he shouted, slamming his fist against the podium. The crowd erupted in applause. But behind the scenes, the IRS and state investigators were quietly building a case. When federal agents raided the church offices, they seized computers, financial ledgers, and dozens of luxury receipts. Among them, private jet rentals, designer clothes, and nearly $400,000 spent on cars, including a custom Bentley registered under Harrell's wife's name. The congregation was in shock. Some members still refused to believe it. Others demanded answers. Harrell's defense was as slick as his sermons. He claimed every purchase was for ministry use. The jet, for traveling to spread the word. The luxury home, a place of hospitality for visiting pastors. The jewelry, gifts to honor those serving God. But the paper trail told another story, one of greed disguised as faith. At trial, the prosecution called witnesses who had once been Harrell's closest allies. The church accountant testified about pressure to falsify expense reports. The sound technician described carrying bags of cash from offerings directly to the pastor's office. The assistant pastor, the same one Harrell had baptized years before, said he'd watched donations vanish faster than they came in. The evidence was overwhelming. $7 million in total misused funds, $2 million personally pocketed. Harrell sat motionless as the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The empire he built crumbled overnight. The church shut its doors. The TV ministry went off air. The luxury home was auctioned, the vehicles seized. Harrell's wife filed for divorce, and his adult son, once the church's youth pastor, publicly denounced him, saying, "My father taught me to serve God." Somewhere along the way, he started serving himself. From prison, Harrell continued to write letters to his remaining followers. Some were long, rambling confessions. Others tried to justify his actions, that he'd only done what every great church leader before him had done: build the kingdom. In one letter leaked to the press, he wrote, "God doesn't measure sin in dollars. He measures it in devotion." The people who once filled his pews have long since moved on. The church building stands empty now, its grand sign, Faith Unlimited, removed years ago. The marble foyer is coated in dust. The golden pulpit, stripped of its shine, leans against a wall like a relic of misplaced faith. Yet sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the broken stained glass, neighbors swear they hear faint echoes of a voice, deep, commanding, certain. The voice of a man who once convinced thousands that greed could sound like gospel, and who learned too late that even the loudest prayers can't drown out the truth. They called him the builder of souls. Reverend Marcus Langston, senior pastor of the River of Grace Ministries in Houston, had a gift that could move people to tears. He could turn a simple Bible verse into a revelation, and he had the kind of voice that filled a room without ever needing a microphone. His congregation loved him, not just for his preaching, but for the way he made them believe their faith could build a better life. For years, Langston's ministry grew quietly, steadily. He started with 30 members and a rented storefront that smelled of candle wax and cheap paint. By his 10th year, the church had swelled to thousands. His sermons were broadcast online, donations poured in from across the country, and he became a regular face at national conferences. He told his followers that God rewards obedience, and that the faithful would one day see heaven on earth. It started small. A new lighting system, better sound equipment, a few paid staff. Nobody questioned where the money went because everything seemed to serve the mission. But in 2014, Langston announced what he called his divine calling, Project Eden. He told the congregation that God had spoken to him during prayer. Build a city of light, he said. A sanctuary, a private school, a food bank, and affordable housing, all under the umbrella of the River of Grace. It sounded impossible, but Langston was persuasive. He held up architectural blueprints during service, wept at the pulpit, and promised that this would be the work that changed lives forever. Donations surged. Families emptied savings accounts, small businesses pledged their profits, and retirees handed over their life insurance payouts. Langston established covenant circles, exclusive donor groups that promised special blessings and private dinners with the pastor himself. He called it sowing into the soil of heaven. Behind the scenes, however, Project Eden was never registered as a non-profit venture. It existed on paper only, a shell company under Langston's name. Funds were funneled into it, and from there into multiple accounts controlled by his wife and his personal assistant. The church's treasurer, a quiet man named Kenneth Lowe, started noticing withdrawals that didn't add up, large amounts labeled vendor payments that led to personal credit cards, hotel bookings, and wire transfers to private accounts in the Cayman Islands. When Kenneth approached Langston, the pastor smiled, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Brother, you can't manage miracles with ledgers." He told him that great vision required great faith, that the Lord himself would provide oversight. But the unease grew. Members began to whisper about Langston's new mansion outside the city, the luxury SUV his wife drove, the first-class flights to mission conferences that no one else attended. In 2016, a journalist from the Houston Chronicle began investigating. It started with a tip from a disillusioned church member, an older woman named Estelle, who had donated nearly $60,000 to Project Eden. She told the reporter that Langston had promised her a place in one of the new housing units when they were built. Years had passed, and the land he'd shown her remained empty. Weeds grew through the gravel where the City of Light was supposed to stand. The investigation snowballed. The paper published a story titled, "The City That Never Was. Where Did Pastor Langston's Millions Go?" Within days, cameras and reporters were swarming the church parking lot. Langston responded with righteous fury. Standing on stage, he called the accusations demonic attacks, meant to destroy God's work. The congregation erupted in applause, chanting his name. But not everyone clapped. Some lowered their heads, realizing the story might be true. Federal authorities opened an investigation. What they found was staggering. Over $6.2 million in diverted donations. Bank records showed payments to high-end jewelry stores, luxury travel agencies, and even a membership at a private golf club. Langston had used church funds to buy 2 homes, a yacht, and an investment property in Belize. The Project Eden account had less than $10,000 left. When the FBI arrived with warrants, Langston tried to appear calm. He shook hands with the agents, smiled for the cameras, and told reporters he had nothing to hide. But as they seized computers and financial records, his confidence began to crack. Inside his office, they found cash envelopes labeled seed offerings, each containing thousands in unreported donations. The church fell into chaos. Members fought in the parking lot, shouting scripture at one another. Some defended him to the end, claiming persecution. Others wept openly, clutching offering receipts like evidence of betrayal. Langston's sermons were removed from the church website, and his face disappeared from the banners. The trial began in 2018. The courtroom was packed every day. Former members, reporters, curious locals. The prosecution laid out a paper trail of greed masked as ministry. Witnesses described pressure to give more, promises of healing, and emotional manipulation disguised as faith. Kenneth Lowe, the treasurer, testified tearfully, saying, "I thought we were building God's kingdom. We were building his." Langston's defense was masterful. His lawyer argued that all spending had been approved for church-related comfort, that as a spiritual leader, he was entitled to certain luxuries. They painted him as a man overwhelmed by success, not corrupted by it. Langston himself took the stand, his voice trembling as he said, "If I failed, it was because I trusted too much in man's process, not enough in God's purpose." But then came the witness the defense didn't expect, his former assistant, Angela Monroe. Calm and precise, she described transferring money at Langston's instruction, signing false invoices, even booking vacations under spiritual retreat categories. She handed over emails where he wrote, "No one questions a miracle, Angela. They just want to see one." The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. Guilty on all counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $5 million. When the verdict was read, Langston showed no emotion. He simply looked up, eyes closed, as if trying to speak to a God that had stopped listening. The aftermath rippled across Houston's faith community. Other pastors distanced themselves publicly. Some congregants refused to step inside another church ever again. The lot where Project Eden was supposed to be built remains fenced off. The sign still there, faded by the Texas sun. A city of light, coming soon. In prison, Langston continued to preach. He led small Bible groups, telling fellow inmates that he was a victim of misunderstanding. "The devil hates builders," he said in one prison interview, "and I was building something too great for him to stand." He published a memoir through a small Christian press titled Broken Altars. In it, he never admitted guilt. Instead, he blamed the cost of leadership. Estelle, the woman who first blew the whistle, keeps a copy of that memoir on her shelf. She never reads it, says she just keeps it there as a reminder of the day she learned faith and greed can wear the same face. "He built something all right," she once told the reporter years later. "Just not for God." Today, the River of Grace Ministries exists in a smaller form, under a new pastor. The congregation rebuilt, slowly and painfully. They hold services in the old building, stripped of luxury, bare except for a cross and a simple wooden pulpit. On the wall, in faded letters, the old church motto still hangs: building faith, changing lives. For those who lived through it, that line feels like both a warning and a confession, because they learned, in the hardest possible way, that when greed enters a pulpit, the gospel becomes a transaction, and salvation becomes just another sale. He used to say that money was only dangerous if you didn't know how to use it for good. Pastor Leonard Crowe built his entire ministry on that belief. To the members of Hope Rising Tabernacle in Ohio, he wasn't just a preacher, he was a visionary. His sermons mixed faith with business, scripture with strategy. He didn't talk about streets of gold in heaven. He talked about building them here on earth. Crowe's voice was low and confident, his eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. When he walked into a room, people felt smaller, as though they were in the presence of a man who'd cracked a divine code. How to turn faith into fortune without guilt. He told them God didn't want his children to be poor, that poverty was a spiritual defect. "If you serve a rich God," he said, "why would you live like a beggar?" At first it worked. The church grew fast. Families who had never owned a home suddenly had hope. He started a faith wealth seminar series, teaching people how to manage their money while honoring God through giving. Attendance doubled every month. Crowe's teaching spread online, and soon, Hope Rising had followers around the world. He started the Abundance Initiative, a program he said would allow members to invest in Christian businesses that served the kingdom. All returns, he promised, would flow back into the church and help fund outreach programs. The idea seemed inspired. Elderly widows, young couples, factory workers, they all poured savings into it. Crowe promised a guaranteed 15% return. "Faith-backed, not risk-backed," he said, smiling from the pulpit. The first few months, checks went out. Real money. Interest payments mailed to members. Proof that their faith was paying off. The buzz grew. Crowe upgraded the church building, installed LED screens, bought a luxury tour bus for evangelism on the road. He held banquets in hotel ballrooms, speaking under spotlights about divine multiplication. But behind the scenes, there were no investments. The Abundance Initiative was a mirage, a Ponzi scheme built entirely on illusion. The early payments came from new donations, cycling through accounts just fast enough to look legitimate. The church treasurer, an older man named Harrell, began to suspect something was wrong when he couldn't verify a single business on the initiative's list. He approached Crowe quietly after a Wednesday night service. Crowe smiled. "Brother Harrell," he said, "you think too small. These are not your typical investments. These are kingdom assets, confidential, divinely appointed." He had a way of saying things that made doubt sound like sin. Harrell didn't push further. Over time, though, the returns slowed. Checks stopped coming. When questioned, Crowe said it was a test of patience, that the blessings were growing unseen, like seeds under the soil. But frustration spread quickly. Members began calling the church office demanding answers. Some had invested tens of thousands of dollars. One single mother sold her home, trusting that God and Crowe would provide. In 2019, an investigative reporter from Cleveland received a tip. It came from a former church secretary who'd quit quietly, terrified of what she'd seen. She claimed Crowe was running an unregistered investment fund and transferring donations into personal accounts. When the story aired on local television, chaos erupted. Crowe stood at the pulpit the following Sunday, holding a Bible in one hand and the microphone in the other. "This is persecution," he shouted. "The enemy fears prosperity in the hands of believers." He called the accusations spiritual warfare. People stood and cheered, crying out prayers for protection. It was theater, masterful, manipulative, and tragically convincing. But the state attorney general's office was already investigating. Bank records showed 5 or 8 million collected from over 400 participants in the initiative. Less than $500,000 had gone to any verifiable cause. The rest had funded luxury cars, international vacations, and personal real estate, including a $1.2 million home in Florida under Crowe's wife's name. When the FBI raided his church office, they found hidden safes filled with cash and watches. One safe held a handwritten note. "Remember, they follow because they believe. Never let them see the numbers." The trial revealed the full picture. Crowe had used scripture as a sales pitch. He quoted Proverbs to justify risk, Corinthians to demand loyalty, and Malachi to guilt the hesitant. Witnesses described being told that questioning him was questioning God's plan. Some broke down on the stand, ashamed of how completely they'd trusted him. Prosecutors called it one of the most elaborate affinity frauds in recent religious history. Crowe's defense tried to paint him as a dreamer, a man who simply got lost in ambition. They played video clips of his sermons, trying to show sincerity. But the numbers spoke louder than his charisma. Millions missing, hundreds of victims. In the end, he was convicted on charges of wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. His sentence? 25 years in federal prison. When asked by reporters if he had anything to say to his followers, Crowe replied, "They'll understand in time." Sometimes faith requires deception to reveal truth. Hope Rising Tabernacle shut down shortly after his conviction. The building was sold to cover restitution costs. Its once golden sign was torn down, leaving only the outline of letters burned into the brick. Some of his former followers still gather informally in small homes. They don't call themselves a church anymore, just friends who pray. Many lost everything, savings, homes, marriages. But what they grieve most isn't the money. It's the innocence that went with it, the idea that faith could never betray them. A journalist who covered the case later described walking through the abandoned church. The stage was stripped bare, wires hanging where the LED screens once glowed. In the center of the floor lay a single laminated pamphlet from one of Crowe's seminars. The title read, "When You Believe, You Multiply." No one knows who left it there. Some say it's poetic justice, others call it haunting. But either way it remains, a reminder of what happens when the Word of God becomes the currency of greed. The town of Benton, Tennessee was small enough that everyone knew when a new car appeared in someone's driveway. So when Pastor Raymond Caldwell pulled up to Sunday service in a brand new black Cadillac Escalade, heads turned. Some clapped, others whispered. He smiled, stepping out in a tailored suit that shimmered in the morning sun, his Bible tucked neatly under one arm. Caldwell wasn't always like this. When he first arrived in Benton 15 years earlier, he drove an old pickup and preached about simplicity. The people loved him for it. He built Harvest Fellowship Church from nothing, a few dozen folding chairs in a rented fire hall to a full congregation of hundreds. He baptized children, led youth programs, and ran food drives. But somewhere between the sermons about humility and the rising tides of success, something shifted. It started with a storm. Literally. In 2015, a tornado ripped through the county, flattening homes and damaging the church roof. Caldwell saw an opportunity, not just to rebuild, but to expand. He launched what he called the Restoration Vision, promising to rebuild the church bigger and better for God's glory. He held late-night prayer drives, posted emotional videos online, and opened a dedicated Rebuild the Vision account for donations. Money poured in. Checks came from across the state, from other churches, even from out-of-state donors who saw his story on social media. Within 6 months, over $1.4 million had been raised. Caldwell thanked everyone publicly, tears streaming down his face. "God multiplies faith through tragedy," he said. This storm was our blessing. But construction moved slowly. Months passed, then a year. The church was still operating out of temporary trailers, while Caldwell's lifestyle changed overnight. He upgraded his home, bought new cars, and began posting photos from spiritual retreats in Miami and the Bahamas. His sermons turned less about grace and more about prosperity, how financial favor was proof of divine approval. "God doesn't bless beggars," he told his congregation one Sunday. "He blesses believers who sow in faith." Some members began to question where the money had gone. A local contractor, hired to begin reconstruction, claimed his payments stopped after the foundation was poured. When asked about it, Caldwell brushed it off. "Delays are God's way of testing our patience," he said. The vision is still alive. But behind closed doors, the church accountant was growing uneasy. Her name was Sheila Grant, quiet, devout, and fiercely loyal. She had managed the books for years, never doubting her pastor. But as she reconciled monthly statements, the numbers didn't make sense. Large cash withdrawals, payments to consultants she didn't recognize, a recurring expense labeled restoration operations tied to a credit card under Caldwell's name. One night, unable to sleep, she logged into the online banking portal and followed the transactions. Flights, hotel stays, fine dining, thousands spent on luxury brands. It felt like a punch to the stomach. She prayed, hoping she was wrong, that there was some explanation. The next morning, she brought the ledgers to Caldwell's office. He didn't deny it. He just smiled and said, "Sheila, when God blesses his shepherd, he blesses his flock. This is kingdom prosperity. You can't put a limit on that." She left in tears and resigned quietly the following week. 2 months later, she walked into the county sheriff's office and handed over a folder containing every suspicious record she'd printed before leaving. That folder became the seed of an investigation that would expose one of the biggest financial frauds in Tennessee's small-town church history. The local district attorney's office began digging. What they found was staggering. Caldwell had diverted more than $900,000 in donations to his personal accounts. He'd used church funds to pay off his mortgage, buy vehicles, and even finance a side business. A small real estate company registered under his cousin's name. The company had purchased multiple rental properties, all generating income that went directly to Caldwell's private accounts. When the news broke, it hit Benton like an earthquake. The people who'd trusted him for years, the same ones who'd knelt beside him in prayer, were suddenly questioning everything. Caldwell took to the pulpit, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. He said the devil was using envy to divide the church. "I have done nothing wrong," he declared. "Every dollar has served the mission." But as investigators subpoenaed records, the lies began to unravel. He'd been making cash withdrawals from donation boxes, labeling them as benevolence expenses. He'd forged invoices for non-existent contractors, and he'd used church credit cards for casino trips, transactions he justified as ministry outreach. The FBI became involved when evidence showed interstate wire transfers tied to donor accounts. The church parking lot became a media circus, news vans parked where children once played tag. Members who once defended him started coming forward. One elderly couple said they'd given $40,000, thinking they were helping rebuild the sanctuary. He said God would see our gift and return it sevenfold, the husband told reporters. Turns out he returned it as heartbreak. Caldwell's arrest came quietly one Thursday morning. Agents found him at home, packing a suitcase. He didn't resist. During interrogation, he claimed everything was for the church's benefit. "You can't have faith without seed money," he said. But prosecutors saw through it. The case built itself. Bank statements, receipts, falsified ledgers, all neatly aligned to one simple truth. The pastor had been stealing from the very people who worshipped him. The trial drew crowds from neighboring towns. Each day the courtroom filled with former members, many of them still torn between anger and disbelief. The prosecution laid out the evidence meticulously, showing how Caldwell had built a pyramid of greed disguised as divine vision. The defense argued that he was simply bad with finances, that he never intended to defraud anyone. But intent wasn't hard to prove when the paper trail spelled indulgence in black and white. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on 19 counts, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $750,000. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he looked at the congregation seated behind him and said softly, "I built this house for God. Maybe I just built too much of myself into the walls." After his conviction, Harvest Fellowship split apart. Half the congregation left organized religion entirely. The rest stayed, rebuilding slowly under new leadership. The unfinished church lot was eventually cleared. Where the new sanctuary was supposed to stand, they planted a community garden instead. Volunteers grow vegetables there now, giving them away to anyone in need. One of the garden's caretakers is Sheila Grant. She never sought fame for exposing the truth. She tends the soil quietly, the same way she once tended the books. When asked why she stayed, she said, "Because the ground doesn't lie. You put in what you mean to grow." That's something the pastor forgot. Today, the church's sign still bears its original name, but the slogan beneath it has changed. It used to read, "Restoring faith, rebuilding futures." Now it simply says, "Faith is earned." If you drive past on a Sunday morning, you can still hear the choir. Smaller, softer, but real. No lights, no screens, no spectacle. Just people singing again, quietly reclaiming what was stolen from them. And in a way, maybe that's what redemption looks like. Not for the man who preached it, but for those who learned painfully that even when greed corrupts the pulpit, grace can still take root in the ashes it leaves behind. The first thing people noticed about Pastor Leonard Briggs wasn't his voice, though it carried like thunder through the church walls, but his smile. Wide, white, magnetic, the kind of smile that made you feel seen, forgiven, and somehow smaller all at once. Briggs ran New Light Tabernacle in Arlington, Texas, one of those booming suburban megachurches that felt more like concert halls than houses of worship. A giant LED cross pulsed above the stage. Spotlights swept over a sea of raised hands. The choir sang over electric guitars and smoke machines. Briggs stood in the center of it all, arms outstretched, commanding attention like a man born to be adored. His sermons drew thousands. "Faith is not a cage," he would shout. "It's a key, and those who use it unlock the riches of God's kingdom." People clapped. They cried. They gave. Briggs had a gift for making money sound holy. His Faith in Action campaign raised millions for outreach projects that few people ever saw. He dressed the part too. Silk suits, gold cufflinks, custom shoes. He told his congregation God wanted them to live abundantly. Why would the children of a king live like peasants? He'd ask. Poverty is not piety. By 2018, New Light Tabernacle had become a brand. There was a YouTube channel, a podcast, even a line of devotional candles and t-shirts. Briggs' face was everywhere. Billboards, posters, television ads. His social media feed looked more like that of a celebrity than a pastor. Private jets, backstage photos, fine dining. Blessed and busy. One caption read beneath a photo of him holding champagne at a gala in Dallas. Behind the camera flash and the sermons, though, a different reality was unfolding. Church staff were quietly quitting. Volunteers whispered about missing funds. A youth leader was dismissed for asking where the outreach donations were going. Briggs kept everything close to himself and his inner circle, a small group of executive ministers who signed off on expenses but rarely saw the books. The first red flag appeared when the IRS contacted the church about unfiled tax forms for a non-profit arm Briggs had created, Lightworks Global Ministries. It was supposed to fund mission trips and humanitarian projects in Africa. Yet when auditors searched for records, they found none. No flights, no supplies, no missions. Only transfers, large, consistent transfers from Lightworks to accounts controlled by Briggs' media company, LJB Enterprises. A journalist named Erica Dean from a local investigative outlet began looking into it after receiving an anonymous tip from a former accountant. The message was brief but explosive. The pastor's funding his empire with your tithes. Check the shell accounts. Dean spent months digging through filings, tracing payments from the church to LLCs with vague names like Faith Media Solutions and Kingdom Consulting. They all led to the same address, a mailbox registered to Leonard Briggs. In December 2019, Dean published her first article, Prosperity and Power. Where does Pastor Briggs' money go? The piece detailed nearly $5 million in questionable transfers, padded travel expenses, and unexplained consulting fees. The story spread fast. Briggs called it a demonic smear campaign. He stood before his congregation the next Sunday, booming with righteous fury. "Do you know what happens when you shine a light?" he said, pacing the stage. "Darkness screams." The devil hates success, especially when it's blessed. The crowd erupted in applause. People believed him. They trusted him. After all, hadn't he built this empire through faith? Hadn't he saved marriages, healed addicts, and brought people to God? But the truth had already taken root. Former staff began speaking out. One woman revealed that Briggs demanded 10% of all love offerings personally, calling it the shepherd's share. Another claimed he'd used church donations to purchase a beachfront condo in Florida under a relative's name. Soon, federal investigators joined the case. Subpoenas went out. Accounts were frozen. When agents arrived at the church offices, they found shredders running and files half destroyed. What remained told the story clearly enough. Years of falsified records, dummy invoices, and kickbacks hidden as ministry partnerships. Briggs had created an ecosystem of lies so elaborate it looked legitimate from the outside. His empire began to crumble piece by piece. The board resigned. Sponsors pulled funding. The once-packed church auditorium became half-empty on Sundays. Briggs doubled down, launching an emotional live stream from his mansion, claiming persecution. "They did this to Jesus too," he said, eyes glistening. "They mock what they can't control." The FBI's indictment landed 3 months later. Wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The numbers were staggering. Nearly $6, $8 million diverted from church donations into personal assets. Investigators seized 3 luxury vehicles, 2 properties, and a bank account holding $2 million. When he was arrested, cameras caught him stepping out of his mansion in handcuffs. He still smiled for the cameras. "The Lord is my defense," he said. The trial that followed became national news. It wasn't just another fallen pastor story. It was a cautionary tale about celebrity faith. Prosecutors described how Briggs had turned his church into a personal ATM. They presented evidence of wire transfers, fake invoices, and luxury vacations booked under mission retreats. They even showed receipts for $15,000 prophetic conferences in Las Vegas, with no record of attendees other than Briggs and his wife. The defense tried to argue it was all a misunderstanding, that Briggs had blurred the lines between ministry and business. He believed his lifestyle inspired faith, his attorney said. But jurors saw through it. The lavish spending, the secrecy, the manipulation. It wasn't inspiration. It was exploitation dressed as piety. During the trial, Erica Dean took the stand. She described months of threats, late-night calls, and anonymous messages warning her to stop digging. She didn't stop. When asked why, she said, "Because truth doesn't hide behind tinted windows." The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. Briggs was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. His wife, co-signer on many of the accounts, received a 3-year sentence for aiding in financial concealment. After the sentencing, Dean published one final piece, "The Cost of the Gospel According to Greed." She ended it with a line that stuck with readers everywhere. "If faith is gold, some men will mine it until the soul runs dry." New Light Tabernacle shut down the following year. The building sat empty for a while before being purchased by a community outreach group that transformed it into a food distribution center. They stripped away the LED cross and stage lights, replacing them with shelves of canned goods and boxes of groceries. Where Briggs once shouted about abundance, volunteers now handed out meals to struggling families. Locals say that on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the open doors, you can still hear faint echoes of music, fragments of old hymns bouncing off the bare walls. Not as spectacle, not as show, but as something simpler, maybe purer. Briggs still sends letters from prison, quoting scripture, insisting he's been misunderstood. "The vision was too big for small minds," he wrote in one letter published by the Dallas Herald. But for those who once filled his pews, it's hard to forget how belief became a weapon, how faith, when twisted by greed, left scars deeper than any sermon could heal. One former member put it best, "We came for God. We left with a receipt." Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. When people in Pine Bluff, Arkansas talked about Pastor Milton Greer, they spoke with a kind of reverence reserved for legends. He wasn't just a preacher. He was a man who had saved the town. At least that's what they believed. When Greer founded River of Mercy Ministries in the late 1990s, Pine Bluff was struggling. The factories had closed, jobs were scarce, and drugs had crept into every neighborhood. Greer's arrival felt like a miracle. He preached on street corners, visited attics and alleyways, prayed over broken families. His voice carried warmth, conviction, and just enough fire to make people believe change was possible. Within a few years, his church became the heartbeat of the town, a refuge for the lost and desperate. But over time, something in Greer's sermons began to shift. The old talk of compassion gave way to something harder, louder. Sermons about divine multiplication and the harvest of giving. He preached that blessings weren't free. They had to be earned through faith, sacrifice, and most of all, generosity. "If you want God to move in your life," he'd thunder, "you've got to move something in his house first." People gave, not because they were rich, but because they trusted him. They gave from paychecks, from retirement funds, from pockets already half empty. Greer would look them in the eyes, promise them miracles, and call it sowing the seed. His operation grew fast. He started a second church in Little Rock, then a third in Memphis. There were revival tours, glossy donation envelopes, and a new slogan painted on banners. "You can't outgive God." But behind the shouting and music, Greer had started something far darker, a multi-million-dollar empire built on emotional manipulation and deception. By 2016, River of Mercy was pulling in over $4 million annually in tithes and faith pledges. Greer began living in a gated mansion 20 miles outside town, complete with a marble driveway, a private gym, and a small theater where he screened recordings of his own sermons. His inner circle, called the Core, was a hand-picked group of loyal staff members who managed the money and handled special blessings. Special blessings were, in reality, investment schemes. Greer promised that donors could partner directly with the kingdom by funding church expansion projects that would yield divine returns. Those who invested would supposedly receive financial blessings. Sometimes, he claimed, 100-fold. The scheme was simple but devastating. He'd promise returns in writing, percentages, even timelines, and cloak it in scripture so thoroughly that few questioned it. For a while, he even sent small payouts to early participants to make the illusion of profit seem real. People began selling property, pulling from savings. handing over everything they had in hopes of being partners in God's plan. It worked until it didn't. In 2018, a retired school teacher named Ruth Wallace came forward. She had invested her entire pension, nearly $90,000, into one of Greer's harvest bonds. The payout date came and went. When she asked about it, she was told to be patient and trust in God's timing. Months passed, then years. No money ever came back. She wrote letters, made phone calls, and was eventually banned from the church for sowing discord. Her story spread quietly through town. Others came forward, families, widows, even a small business owner who had mortgaged his home to sow into the expansion. All told, nearly 200 people claimed to have lost their life savings. The truth began to surface when an accountant hired to review church books for a potential donor discovered severe discrepancies. Money meant for church projects was being diverted to shell corporations under Greer's name. Luxury cars, private jet rentals, and personal vacations were all being billed as ministry operations. When federal investigators finally got involved, they uncovered a paper trail stretching across 5 states. Multiple accounts, false invoices, and a network of LLCs designed to hide assets. The scheme wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. Greer had used his church as a front for a faith-based Ponzi operation worth nearly $9 million. But even as the walls closed in, Greer doubled down. He called the investigation a witch hunt, claiming Satan had infiltrated the government. He preached louder than ever, urging followers to stand firm. "If they can crucify Jesus," he shouted, "they can come for me too." Some believed him. They held prayer vigils outside the courthouse. They blamed the victims for losing faith. One man told reporters, "If Pastor Greer said God told him to do this, who are we to question it?" The illusion finally broke when agents raided his mansion and found cash hidden in hollowed-out Bibles, safe deposit keys taped behind picture frames, and ledgers that spelled out every transaction. They even found donation envelopes from specific congregants, still unopened, sitting in boxes labeled "Future Blessings." Greer was arrested on multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and securities fraud. The town that once worshipped him was forced to watch their spiritual leader led away in handcuffs. His trial was long and painful. Victims testified one after another, describing how they'd trusted him completely, how he'd looked them in the eye, prayed over their checks, and promised them the world. Ruth Wallace's voice trembled as she read her statement. "You told me God would multiply my faith. I didn't know he meant by zero." Prosecutors painted a clear picture, a man who'd built his wealth by selling salvation. They showed records of private jet charters to the Cayman Islands, designer watches, and expensive art purchases labeled as mission gifts. The defense tried to argue that Greer had only blurred financial lines, that his intent was spiritual, not criminal. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The verdict came after only 4 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts. The sentence, 27 years in federal prison and restitution of $6 million. When asked if he wanted to speak before sentencing, Greer rose, smiled faintly, and said, "I never took from the church. I just moved God's money the way he told me to." It was the last sermon he ever gave. In Pine Bluff, River of Mercy shut its doors within weeks. The massive sanctuary that once echoed with song became silent. Vandals spray-painted "Thieves of Faith" across the front steps before the property was seized by the bank. For a while, the town seemed haunted, not by ghosts but by the weight of betrayal. Families avoided each other in grocery aisles. People whispered about the ones who gave too much. Trust, once sacred, had become toxic, but something unexpected grew from the wreckage. A group of former congregants, led by Ruth Wallace, founded a small outreach center called the True River. No tithes, no pledges, no promises of prosperity, just meals for the hungry and support for those rebuilding their lives. They met in a rented storefront, using folding chairs and borrowed instruments. It was quiet, humble, and real. Ruth hung one framed photo on the wall, a shot of the old church before everything fell apart. Beneath it, she wrote one line, The truth doesn't need lights. Years later, when a reporter revisited Pine Bluff for a follow-up, Ruth was still there. Her hair had gone gray, her hands trembled when she poured coffee, but her faith, the kind that isn't sold or shouted, remained. "You can forgive a thief," she said, "but you can't forget what he stole. Because sometimes it wasn't money, it was the part of you that believed. And maybe that's the cruelest crime of all, when faith itself becomes the victim." In the quiet outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, stood Grace Haven Chapel, a modest white church surrounded by live oaks and moss. For years it was a place of peace. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, the rhythm of life passed through those doors. And at the heart of it all was Pastor Daniel Holt. Holt was the kind of man people trusted instantly. Soft-spoken, with silver hair and a voice that carried calm authority, he'd been in ministry for over 30 years. He was known for visiting the sick at all hours, for comforting widows, for being, as one congregant put it, the kind of man you'd want to pray over your last breath. But underneath that calm surface was a hunger that had been quietly growing. Holt's downfall began, as many do, with something that looked like success. In 2012, the church received an unexpected blessing, a $3 million inheritance from an elderly member who'd passed away with no family. The gift was meant to expand the church's community programs, a food pantry, youth center, and addiction recovery initiative. The congregation celebrated. They believed God had opened a new chapter. Holt stood before them that Sunday and promised transparency. "Every dollar will serve the mission," he said, holding the check in the air. "This is not our money, it's God's." The applause lasted nearly a full minute. But over the next year, progress was slow. The food pantry's lease fell through. The youth center remained a set of blueprints on a wall. And the money, quietly, discreetly, began to move. Holt started a new account labeled Grace Haven Development Fund. Only he and the church treasurer had access. From there, transfers began, $10,000, $25,000, sometimes $50,000 at a time, to a consulting firm run by Holt's nephew. When the treasurer questioned it, Holt assured her the firm was handling property acquisition for expansion. Except no property was ever purchased. What was purchased were investments, stocks, private shares, and cryptocurrency, all under accounts tied to Holt's personal ID. He told himself it was temporary, that he was simply growing the gift. If he doubled it, tripled it, the church could do even more. He justified every click of the mouse as faith in action. But as with most secret ambitions, it didn't stop there. Soon Holt was drawing from the fund to cover short-term ministry expenses. A new car, for travel. A luxury retreat, for prayer. Then a down payment on a second property near Tybee Island, for pastoral rest. By 2015, nearly $800,000 had been siphoned from church funds into Holt's personal ventures. And then the investments crashed. A cryptocurrency collapse wiped out nearly everything overnight. Holt sat alone in his study, the glow of his computer screen reflecting off tear-streaked cheeks, realizing he couldn't repay what he'd taken. Panic set in. He began moving money around frantically, pulling from other church accounts, creating fake invoices for maintenance, anything to fill the growing hole. But numbers don't pray away guilt. They only grow heavier. It was the church secretary, Margaret Lewis, who finally noticed the inconsistencies. She'd been with Grace Haven for 20 years, long before the inheritance. As she prepared the annual financial report, she noticed line items that didn't make sense. Consulting fees, property acquisition, digital investments. When she asked Holt for documentation, he grew defensive. "Margaret," he said sharply, "you've been with me long enough to know some things are handled spiritually, not on paper." She didn't argue. But that night, she copied every document she could access and brought them home. When she showed them to her son, an accountant, he frowned. "Mom," he said quietly, "this isn't mismanagement. It's theft." Margaret didn't want to believe it. She loved Holt. He'd baptized her grandchildren. He'd prayed at her husband's funeral. But she also loved the truth. And after weeks of praying for clarity, She made a decision that would tear her church apart. She called the district attorney's office. When investigators arrived, Holt tried to cooperate at first. He handed over ledgers, bank records, all carefully curated. But forensic accountants quickly found discrepancies. Transfers that didn't match invoices. Missing funds that traced back to personal accounts. When confronted, Holt broke down in tears. "I was only trying to bless the church," he said. "I thought I could fix it before anyone knew." The arrest sent shockwaves through Savannah. The headline read, "Beloved pastor accused of embezzling church funds." Congregants gathered outside the courthouse, crying, praying, refusing to believe it. Some called it persecution. Others began to accept the unthinkable, that the man who preached integrity had built his ministry on deceit. At trial, prosecutors presented years of records, over 100 transactions moving church money into personal accounts. They showed property deeds, receipts for luxury items, and emails where Holt discussed growing the portfolio before the board finds out. The defense argued that Holt had no intent to steal, that he'd simply made poor decisions trying to multiply the inheritance. But the prosecution countered with a line that silenced the courtroom. Faith isn't a financial plan. It's a trust. And Pastor Holt broke it. The jury found him guilty on all counts: wire fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying records. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and ordered to repay $2 million. After the sentencing, Margaret visited him one last time. She found him sitting in the prison chapel, hands folded, eyes distant. He smiled weakly when he saw her. "I wanted to make it grow," he said quietly. "For them. For all of us." She nodded, tears welling. "But it wasn't yours to plant." He looked down at his hands, whispering, "I know." Grace Haven closed for a year after his conviction. The pews gathered dust, the choir disbanded. It felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. But slowly, through the efforts of a small group of remaining members, the doors reopened. They rebuilt not with money but with trust, the kind earned in silence over time. The inheritance that had once cursed them now served a different purpose. The church sold Holt's seized properties and used the restitution to open a small shelter downtown. They called it Haven House. No offering plates, no grand promises, just a kitchen, a few cots, and a cross on the wall. Years later, Holt was released early for good behavior. He never returned to ministry. Instead, he worked quietly for a nonprofit doing bookkeeping. When a journalist interviewed him years later, he said, "I used to think the devil tempted me with sin, but he didn't. He tempted me with opportunity." There's a certain irony in that, how greed can disguise itself as good intentions. At Grace Haven now, a small wooden plaque hangs near the entrance. It reads, "Faith cannot be multiplied by theft." The paint is faded, but the words endure. A reminder carved from Betrayal, standing against the illusion that money can ever buy redemption. And if you drive past the chapel today, you'll see the same old oaks, the same moss swaying in the wind. Inside, a few dozen people still gather on Sundays, their prayers quiet but sincere. The music is softer, the sermons humbler. They still talk about Pastor Holt sometimes, not with anger, but with a kind of mournful understanding. Because what happened to him wasn't just about money. It was about what happens when faith stops being about serving God and starts being about managing Him. In the end, Holt learned too late what his congregation already knew. The moment you start counting your blessings in dollars, you stop recognizing them as grace. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Was it the quiet manipulation, the lavish betrayals, or the way faith itself became a tool for deceit? Tell us in the comments below, and if you've seen corruption masked as devotion, your story might be the next one we uncover.